Hey, good evening. Hope my sound is okay. I'll wait just a couple of seconds here. People start coming in. Indeed. All right. Well, tonight's discussion is about Osama bin Laden, and he warrants a further in depth discussion. Now, a lot of people ask me who he really is. Is he always a terrorist? What was he like in his younger years? And who was his primary influences in his ideology and methodology? And hopefully, I can answer some of those questions tonight in regards to his profile and his background. I've written a lengthy article about him, which I'll link in the description below. And if we are to understand the profile of Osama bin Laden, we have to go back to his childhood years. Bin Laden was actually born in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. His father, Mohammed bin Laden, who is the founder of the most successful construction magnate in all of the Gulf, which is the Saudi bin Laden group. Uh, bin Laden's father himself started out as a porter and worked his way up to become, to finance his own organization. And in less than 10 years, it became the most successful construction company in the Gulf. His mother is Hamida Al Atas, also known as Elia Ghanen, a Syrian woman. Um, this was the only son that she would ever bore. And Osama is the 18th child out of 25 brothers and sisters. There's a large family. And throughout his younger years, bin Laden was not really in a religious household. The family is a Sunni background. Um, Osama's mother was from the middle class tribe in Latakia, Syria, and she was secularist. Incidentally enough, Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, was a Sunni Muslim, but when bin Laden was growing up, Osama, he didn't really wasn't literate in the Quran, although he did study it from time to time. He studied karate when he was younger, and then later on, he would actually uh, become enrolled at the King Abdulaziz University, where he studied electrical engineering. However, an incident that would mark Osama bin Laden's life for many years to come, his father had died in an airplane crash in Saudi Arabia while touring a potential site for the construction company in 1967. The irony is that his father has actually died in a plane crash. This will not be the first time that a family member would die in a plane crash. Um, Bin Laden then went to a modestly secular school where he studied economics and business at the Al Thagr Model School located in Jeddah. And then at 19, he would enroll at King Abdulaziz University for business administration and receive his degree in civil engineering in 1979. Now, during the years 75 to 79, bin Laden was actually a womanizer, would actually get drunk. He was without a father figure at this time. And his older brother, Salim bin Laden, he saw as his authority figure in the family. Um, but throughout his teenage years and his early 20s, bin Laden was actually very soft spoken. He was very tall, 6'4", so he stood out. but he remained assuredly reserved in his manner. Was didn't speak when he was out of line. He only spoke when he needed to. Uh, Even though he conducted himself quite irrationally when he was at King Abdulaziz University, but while he was there, he would become quite interested in a speaker that would visit the university and who taught Sharia studies at the university as well. And his name was Abdullah Yusuf Azam. He took a liking to Azam right away because he thought of him as a great orator, a fantastic speaker, a motivating character. And this would give bin Laden some motivation to do something with his life because at this point, he really didn't know what to do with himself. Um, and it was right after he completed his courses and got his degree for electrical engineering that the Soviets had invaded the capital of Kabul in Afghanistan. Uh, for the year prior, the Muslim community, the Afghan community in Kabul, had tried to raise awareness that the communist bloc in Afghanistan was becoming a threat to the Muslims themselves. And of course, there was numerous instances of atrocities toward Afghans and Muslims in the country through previous communist dictators. And so at this time, when a foreign invader invaded a Muslim country, the Islamic community wanted to get involved. Russia was seen as an enemy because of the ideology of communism, as well as them being a secular country. A dual headed sword, which was a threat to not just Afghanistan, but also to the Muslim community and global Islamic world. Because if they could take over Afghanistan, they could take over Pakistan. So bin Laden had offered himself and his father's construction vehicles to build ditches, to build roads. And after a while, he was seen as a pariah in the country, a hero. Here's a man who comes from a very prominent background, from the most prominent construction company in the Gulf, a millionaire many times over. And he comes and he offers his services to the Afghan Mujahideen, who viewed Arabs very negatively. And that wasn't the case here with bin Laden. Bin Laden began making friends with notable Afghan leaders like Juladdin Haqqani, who would later become the founder of the Haqqani network in Pakistan, Abu Haraj al-Iraqi, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Abdul Rasul Sayaf, and a couple of others. The liberation of Afghanistan was bin Laden's focal point. And at this time, there was no Al Qaeda to speak of. There was no worldwide terrorist network, save for the Abu Nadal organization, which was basically a secular organization, not a radical fundamentalist organization. Not much is really known about bin Laden to this point. And if there was any intelligence services that were to know just the basics about bin Laden to this point, it would be the Pakistan ISI and the Central Intelligence Agency, only because those were the primary agencies who became invested in Afghanistan. Throughout this time, bin Laden had opened up a training camp in which I spoke about before in a previous live discussion about Al Qaeda. The name of the camp is al-Masri. It was the only Arab camp that was allowed to operate in Afghan borders under the authority of Abdul Rasul Sayyaf from Peshawar, Pakistan. And so he was in charge of this training camp. And later, other camps like Al Farouk, Wal Jihad would later open up. And these would be Arab camps. But these camps were not necessarily camps that were training in terrorism, but in guerrilla warfare, teaching Afghans how to conduct in guerrilla warfare. The Afghans were very notable warriors, and they viewed Arabs negatively in terms of fighting skill. However, when it comes to bombs and orthodox measures of guerrilla warfare, the Arabs were pretty well put. Now, at this time, there was a notable influence entering the country. And they would be known as Egyptian Takfiris. Takfiri, meaning a Muslim who apostatizes other Muslims. These were people of a Wahhabi background. Members of two Islamic organizations in Egypt called the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and the Gamma Islamiyah. And the notable leaders of these groups who would enter Afghanistan were Ayman al-Zawahiri, Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, and Abu Hafs al-Masri. These were members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad who were trying to overthrow the Arab government in Egypt, but they were arrested, detained, some of them were tortured, and later they were thrown out of the country, well, forced out. Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was a doctor, got a job at the Red Crescent in Pakistan, treating Afghan wounded soldiers. Sayyid Imam al-Sharif became a teacher at this point, and Abu Hafs al-Masri, who would be later renamed to a Mohammed Atef, was a military commander and former military officer in the Egyptian army. So a lot of these Egyptians that would enter Afghanistan and Pakistan had a background in Egyptian military. At this time, the Bin Laden family was also becoming involved with another family, and that is the Bush family. In the early 1980s, individual by the name of James Bath had introduced a young Texan, George H.W. Bush, the son of George W. Bush, to an individual by the name of Salim Bin Laden. Salim Bin Laden, who I said before is the older brother of Osama Bin Laden. And through the Bin Laden family, they would give George H.W. Bush financial aid to build a oil company called Arbusto Energy. Arbusto Energy was run by George H.W. Bush and James Bath and a conglomeration of others. And soon enough, the Bin Laden family would become close associates to the Bush family. In fact, Salim Bin Laden would actually visit the Bush family in Houston. But there would be a lot of business dealings between the Bush family, the Bin Laden family, and also a nefarious institution called the Bank of Credit of Commerce, or well known as BCCI Bank. BCCI Bank was run by Khalid bin Mahfouz, who had connections with the Bin Laden family, especially Salim Bin Laden. And in 1979, a Arbusto Oil Company would be up and running. Salim Bin Laden got a house in Orlando, Florida, and he would use it for vacation days when he traveled to the United States. But Osama bin Laden at this point became disconnected with his family, while his older brothers were invested in the Saudi bin Laden group. Osama bin Laden was invested in Afghanistan. And because of this, he became influenced by notable figures that were older than him, like Abdullah Azzam and Ayman al-Zawahiri. Soon after a couple of years, bin Laden, who was not known to be a militant at this time, along with the Egyptians, created through the help of Abdullah Nas and Abdullah Azzam, created an organization that recruited Muslims worldwide to the war, which was the Maktab al-Kidmat, or from the English, the Afghan Services Bureau. Through here, and through the many buildings that were surrounded, I think it was in total 8 buildings in Pakistan, where they would teach religious studies, military studies, theological studies, media, training in small arms fire. Azzam wanted to shape these people for a spiritual war. Bin Laden disagreed and said the only way you could defeat these people is through being violent by aggressive means, meaning the Soviets. Many Arabs from around the world found bin Laden to be much more influential than Abdullah Azzam. And bin Laden began creating an ego for himself. And at this point, the Egyptians, like Dr. al-Amin al-Zawahiri, Abu Hafs al-Masri, and Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, started noticing that bin Laden could be more useful to them. And bin Laden saw them as useful to him. And this is where bin Laden started to change his ideology. Meanwhile, the CIA, the Pakistan ISI, the British MI6, the Israeli Mossad, all began funneling to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars through the Pakistan ISI so they could remain covert. And some of that money went to NGOs and to the Maktab al-Kidmat, not just in Pakistan, but also in New York, Arizona, Houston, and other cities. Bin Laden would actually travel to Indianapolis. I believe this was in 1984. Don't quote me on the year. And he would go see Abdullah Azzam speak. Abdullah Azzam, Ayman al-Zawahiri would travel to the United States and try to recruit Muslims to the war in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, the Arab camps started getting more popular because bin Laden became more popular. And they saw him as a money machine. Here's a man with tens of millions at his disposal who could help and who was helping the Afghans against the Soviets. The CIA ran an operation called Operation Cyclone. Operation Cyclone, which was the largest CIA operation in existence. Over $103 million was funneled through the Pakistan ISI. But to this point, in the mid 1980s and maybe even the late 80s, bin Laden still didn't have a worldview where he wanted to attack Western institutions, the United States or Israel. Because right now the focal point was to remove the communists out of Afghanistan, to defeat the Soviets. And so the United States agreed with this notion of removing the Soviets from the country through Operation Cyclone with the authority of then President Reagan and his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, would start helping and paving the way of the Afghans and the Arabs by sending them Stinger missiles, which would be used to shoot down aircraft. The Egyptians, who were military advisors and former commanders of the Egyptian army, would become proficient in using these missiles, and through the United States' own ignorance, if you will, and I'm using that term lightly, they entered a contract where they would give a certain amount of Stinger missiles to these Afghan groups in the hopes of those Stinger missiles returning back to the United States. I will lead you to your own imagination whether those Stinger missiles were returned. So, with all this money and all this training by the intelligence services throughout the 1980s to the Arabs, to the Afghans, this guerrilla warfare, the unorthodox measures of warfare were being trained to these people who were coming from all around the world. The jihad of Afghanistan. And bin Laden saw the rewards of this. And by 1989, the Soviets retreat. They agreed to retreat with Pakistan acting as the mediator. Bin Laden returns to Saudi Arabia, victorious. And on in 1989, Abdul Azam is assassinated by a car bomb. The man who had helped mentor bin Laden in his early years about the nature of jihad, who grew out of favor with bin Laden later, and Ayman al-Zawahiri and the Egyptian Takfiris who spread false rumors about Azam. And most likely the reason for this was that they could take over the Afghan Services Bureau, in which they did, with Azam being killed by a roadside bomb. Bin Laden later gave a eulogy regarding Abdul Azam, saying that he was the father figure that he didn't have in the last 10 years. On January 22nd, 1991, the Saudi kingdom were told the Iraqi army was going to invade Kuwait. The city is Wafra. However, Russian spy planes had dismissed the claims that the Iraqi military were close to invading the kingdom. They did invade Kuwait, but the threat and the rumors posited by the United States intelligence services, the CIA, as well as the State Department, forced the Saudis to make a decision. Bin Laden had called for a reconvenience of the kingdom's top military leadership and their government. Attending was King Fahd and the head of the General Intelligence Directorate, Prince Turki bin Faisal. Bin Laden then pleaded with the kingdom that he would use the Mujahideen, as well as members of his Arab camps, including the Egyptians, to fight against the Iraqi military. The kingdom was actually shocked that he would allow this rebel group to defend the kingdom from a formidable army at this point. And so they declined. And because they feared bin Laden and what this Mujahideen could do, because they were partly responsible for the removal of the Soviets, if you will, they put bin Laden under house arrest. The religious institution in Saudi Arabia started complaining about the kingdom being now influenced by the West. The United States then offered their services to defend the kingdom as long as they can have a permanent military base there. The Saudis agreed, and this enraged bin Laden, enraged the religious community in Saudi Arabia, as well as the Takfiris in Egypt, and to the Salafis worldwide. According to Peter Bergen, who wrote the book The Osama bin Laden I Knew, there was a closed door meeting between Prince Turki bin Faisal, head of the GID, and bin Laden, in which bin Faisal offered him an ultimatum. They would unfreeze his family's assets, give him back his passport if he were to leave the country. Bin Laden agreed. Bin Laden sent some emissaries to the Sudan because at the Sudan, it was the only country in the world that didn't check for backgrounds of people entering the country. There was no immigration services in the Sudan. And also, one of the primary leaders and the most influential Muslim on the planet, Hassan al-Turabi of the National Islamic Front, had invited bin Laden to come to the country, in which he did. He also saw the benefits of having bin Laden, who was a multimillionaire, of being in the country because the Sudan was under economic hardships themselves. Bin Laden traveled with the Arab camps, members of his Arab camps, like Darunta, Al Farouk, and Al Masada, and as well as the Egyptians that traveled with him. And in 1992, he entered the country. And it was here that he started formulating an organization with under the influence of the Egyptians. And this group would later be known as Al-Qaeda, the base. The base meaning Al-Masada, which was the base of operations, the first base Arab training camp. And so from here, notable Egyptian military leaders like Ali Muhammad, Abu Hafs al-Masri, Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, Abu Haraj al-Iraqi started training the Arabs here as they build up training camps. And bin Laden began investing heavily in the country. Members of the group that bin Laden had built are some names that you must come familiar with because these would be the people who helped to create Al Qaeda. And their names are Abu Ayyab al Iraqi, Abu Ubaidah al Banshiri, Abu Faraj al Yemeni, Ayman al Zawahiri, Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, also known as Dr. Fadl, Abu Burham al Iraqi, Abu Hafs al-Masri, later known as Mohammed Atef, and Mahmoud Salim. They would create, and Jamal al-Fadl. They would create two committees, a Shura committee, which was head of religious matters, in other words, Wahhabi ideology, not Sunni theology, a military committee headed by the Egyptians like Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, Abu Hafs al-Mansuri, and Abu Hafs al-Masri. These were basically Arabs and Egyptians who had a military background. And of course, a Fatwa studies committee, which was in charge of declaring fatwas. And that's Ayman al-Zawahiri, Abu Faraj al-Yemeni, and Abu Sa'd al-Sharif. And there was also a media committee. And this was led by Abu Musab Reuter. And if that sounds familiar, it's not Reuters, which was the part of the legacy committee, the legacy media, Reuters. No, not the European, but it's funny. His last name is Reuter, right? However, these committees would help form the organization Al Qaeda. And to understand Al Qaeda a little bit better, if you're a native Arabic speaker, there are very important documents called the Tariq and Osama documents. And you can find them online, but they are in the Arabic. And these are important documents and files. And it shows you the beginning stages of Al Qaeda and their beliefs and what they believe. And Al Qaeda used to have applications for people who were involved with the organization, what their name was, their family line, where they came from, their specific skill sets. And so this organization started becoming a little bit more constructed, a little more business-like, if you will. And it basically had a number of different uh, committees later on. It would become more um, structured within the organization. But up to this point, the CIA had begun monitoring bin Laden while he stood in a house in Khartoum, Sudan. And it was here that bin Laden actually started spending to the tunes of uh, upwards up to $5 to $10 million. And he would spend a lot more than that building the infrastructure into Sudan under the tutelage of Hassan al-Turabi. Still, to this point, Al Qaeda did not have any geopolitical or military strategic goals or an enemy at this point. So they still, up until this point, weren't a terrorist organization, mind you. But the CIA was still intimately aware of who bin Laden was and who Al Qaeda was beginning to be, as well as the Pakistan ISI. Through the massive influences of the Egyptians, they started to push bin Laden to an area. The Egyptians brought an ideology called the near enemy and the far enemy. Now, I explained what this was to give it a short rundown. The Egyptians believed in the elimination of Arab secular governments and replacing them with Islamist ones, meaning the near enemy. But it would take too long to overthrow these Egyptian governments. Meanwhile, in Egypt, under Hosni Mubarak, there were a number of times they tried to assassinate him using the Egyptian terrorist groups like Egyptian Islamic Jihad and Gamma Islamiyah. But they failed. And so they thwarted that ideology and pushed bin Laden to entertain the far enemy approach, conducting warfare against the United States and Israel. This would only be successful if the Arab governments were overthrown, creating a larger Islamic union. But they didn't have the time for this. And whether this ideology was pushed either by the Egyptians or from assets within the organization, because we don't really know who's entering Al Qaeda at this point. Could be anybody. I mean, they really didn't have a strict security code. And later on, that would become a lot more relaxed in Afghanistan. But meanwhile, in the Sudan, bin Laden had begun to capture the attention of the CIA and the Pakistan ISI. There was an operation under President Bill Clinton to use uh, to try and assassinate bin Laden at this point. Two CIA case agents, one by the name of Billy Waugh and the other Kofor Black. Both men were involved in the successful capture of a terrorist by the name of Carlos the Jackal in the Sudan. And so the CIA saw the growing threat of Al Qaeda and bin Laden and asked Bill Clinton for approval in assassinating Osama bin Laden, and Bill Clinton refused, saying that it would be too costly. And the CIA, who basically were being still in the shadows because of the church committee hearings, which subjugated the CIA to an extent in regards to their shadowy tactics of assassinations abroad and overthrowing uh, governments. In 1953, they were behind the overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammed Mossadegh in Iran, as well as their nefarious agendas in Central America, El Salvador, Nicaragua. And so the CIA was really handcuffed, tied in the late 80s, early 90s. And so they were trying to get back in the good graces of the State Department and to the public. And so Bin Laden and Bill Clinton told them no. Meanwhile, in the Sudan, Ali Mohammed and Abu Ubaidah Bashiri began to train these Al Qaeda fighters in small arms fire, guerrilla warfare, unorthodox tactics, building bombs, how to build makeshift bombs, pipe bombs, as well as the use of Stinger missiles, which were from the CIA in Operation Cyclone, and their use of RPGs, PK machine guns, AK 47s. And so their operation became a little bit more bigger and bigger and bigger. And so the use of weaponry became more extravagant. In 1993, you had the Battle of Mogadishu, which everybody knows as Black Hawk Down from the film. It is asserted through a number of sources that Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda under the Egyptians trained members of the groups that were trying to overthrow the Somali government, and one of them was Mohammed Farah Adid. The members of the Mogadishu group were exceptional in using Stinger missiles and RPGs. And later on, it came out through a number of independent reports that would come and investigate this war. It was asserted that Al Qaeda had trained the Mogadishus in the use of Stingers and RPGs. The same ones that were given by the CIA to the Arabs in the Afghan war against the Soviets. Those same Stinger missiles would be used to shoot down U.S. planes in Mogadishu in 1993. After that, you had the World Trade Center bombing. This wasn't Al Qaeda. Now, there are some reports, of course, the legacy media, the State Department, certain elements of the State Department will tell you that, yes, Al Qaeda was involved with the bombing of the World Trade Center. No, they were not. They were not a terrorist organization to this point. And any expert authority that will tell you that Al Qaeda was not a terrorist threat to this point. Not yet. Anyway. Because of this, the United States government pressured the Sudanese government to expel Osama bin Laden and the Al Qaeda from the Sudan. The United States State Department in 1995 accused the Sudan of sponsoring international terrorism and of operating training camps in the Sudanese desert. However, according to Sudanese officials, this stance became obsolete because the Islamist political leader of the National Islamic Front, Hassan al-Sharawi, had lost influence in the country. And the Sudanese wanted to engage with the U.S., but American officials refused to meet with them even after they forced bin Laden out of the country. And it wasn't until I think the year 1999 or 2000 that they began relations again, the Sudanese and the United States. However, the damage was already done. Bin Laden took this as an insult, but he understood what was happening. The United States was forcing bin Laden, saying he's a terrorist group that was involved with a Yemen hotel bombing, although there's little evidence to show for this. And very few people knew the name Osama bin Laden to this point. 1996, Osama bin Laden travels back to Afghanistan with an open welcome from the Taliban. The Taliban at this point had risen to prominence. They were coming from the madrasas in Peshawar and Jalalabad and Islamabad. And the leader of this group is Muhammad Mullah Omar. They had a different interpretation other than the Arabs. The Taliban were from a Hanafi school of law. The Hanafis are regarded by modern scholarship as the first to formally adopt and institute qiyas to as a method to derive Islamic law when the Quran or Hadith are silent or ambiguous. The Wahhabis, on the other hand, led by the Takfiris of the Egyptians, they're Wahhabi too, they apostatize other Muslims. Even though the Hanafis and the Wahhabis share certain commonality within the theology, they're different. The Wahhabis are extroverts. The Hanafis are introverts. Whereas the Taliban didn't want to expand beyond Afghan's borders. The Wahhabis want to take over the whole world. And so that was the threat that bin Laden posed that Abu Nadal didn't have. Abu Nadal, who's a secular Arab terrorist, but was a contractor for a number of countries, including Israel, Germany, Libya, Iraq. He would terrorize when the money was right. Bin Laden offered an even greater threat when it comes to the United States point of view, is that even though Abu Nadal was a worldwide terrorist leader, he didn't have a global reach like Al Qaeda was going to have. And that their ideology is a religious one. Religious. Their ideology went against the Quran, incidentally. Bin Laden now was under the influence of the Egyptians, and so took the foreign area approach when he landed in Afghanistan. And in 1996, he created his first fatwa. And the first fatwa was against the U.S. military stationed in Mecca and Medina. The fatwa came from the Shura Council of Al Qaeda, which is not recognized even by Saudi Arabia or any of those Wahhabi imams, even though they sympathized to this point with bin Laden. They sympathized with his point about fighting against the West. Because here you have the United States stationed in the most holiest land in all of Islam, Mecca and Medina. If you're a conspiracy theorist, you may see as the reason why the United States did this. Was it to goad Osama bin Laden? Or was it to use Saudi Arabia as a strategic launching pad? It could be both. It could be other reasons as well. However, this was a major reason as to why bin Laden hated the United States, as well as another reason, and that was the United States' treatment of the Iraqis in the first Gulf War, in which their economic sanctions through the Food for Oil program, which led to the deaths of over 550,000 men, women, and children, mostly elderly and children, in the poorer southern regions of Iraq. Later on, bin Laden, who at this point was starting to become a little bit more familiar with the world, but not to the point in 6 years later, he started giving interviews with media. And in those media articles that circulated worldwide, he gave his reasons for advocating for the first fatwa against the United States. Nothing to do with our freedoms, nothing to do with Christianity, everything to do with foreign policy toward Israel, toward Saudi Arabia. This would echo on years and years and years, but the State Department would continue to lie about the reasons why bin Laden hated the United States. And that was because so that you, the public, would not question the foreign policy of the United States, in which is being influenced by the Israeli lobby, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, and the Gulf lobby, which was basically more covert, more secretive, because they share nothing in common with the United States, and everybody views them as head choppers and backwards people. That was the American perception of them. And so they would give tens of millions of dollars to the Democrat, Republican parties in the hopes of having certain legislation passed in their favor, as well as addressing the Palestinian problem in Israel. Bin Laden starts pushing the issue. The Taliban wanted to restrict bin Laden's access to the media because they didn't want the United States to become aggressive to the Taliban for fear that they would invade the country. And they were already engaging in a civil war against the Northern Alliance headed by Ahmad Shah Massoud for control of the country. The FBI at this point were putting out feelers about this Saudi financier in Afghanistan. Who is this Osama bin Laden? Who is this person? They're starting to finally get familiar with this name. Meanwhile, the NSA had already begun tapping bin Laden's satellite phone, which I outlined in my first live video discussion. And also, the CIA was well aware of who bin Laden was, which, whether you want to believe that they started knowing who he was in Afghanistan in 1979, 1980, or when he was in the Sudan in 1992. I think they knew him all the way back in 1979. They saw the potential that this guy had. The threats that would come from the group Al Qaeda would start to permeate the mindsets of the intelligence community. Here they are. Here's a real threat, the one that could replace the Cold War, the one that could replace communism. And so the Pentagon, the intelligence apparatuses, they can ask for more money in regarding to expanding their respective institutions. And so they went before the Senate Select Committee. the House Appropriations Committee and asked for more funding, in which they got. Foreign policy started to change. Likud Zionism through Israel under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in 1996 saw the potential threat of Al Qaeda and started linking that with the whole Islamic world. Even though the Islamic world at this point condemned bin Laden, including one of the primary influences of his early formation of Al Qaeda, Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, who would later condemn Al Qaeda and bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri as saying that to kill innocent men, women, and children is against Islam as a whole. So he condemns bin Laden and he condemns Ayman al-Zawahiri, and he wouldn't be alone. Other members of the early Al Qaeda formation saw what was happening, that this group was now turning into what they didn't devise the organization initially. Initially, they weren't a terrorist group. Initially, they were just a training camp, a group that would adhere to expelling non-Islamic states or nations from Muslim lands. And so when bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri went down the road of the far enemy approach, this is when a number of Al-Qaeda people started to disassociate from the group and spoke out against it too. At this point in 1997, an individual by the name of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed becomes into view. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who would later become the mastermind of 9/11, was at this point a freelance terrorist financier and operator. He's involved with the Pachinko plot. He's also involved with a money transfer that went to Mohammed Saleh for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. That's how the FBI knew about him. And the CIA apparently ignores a warning from a recently retired CIA agent named Robert Baer of the Middle East Institute, Middle East Affairs Division. Baer had left the CIA in late 1997 and began private consulting in the Middle East to the White House. And Baer soon meets Hamad bin Jassim bin Hamad Al Thani, who is Qatar's Minister of the Economy and Chief of Police. Al Thani would tell Baer that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is now bin Laden's chief of terrorist operations. Now, this is basically that bin Laden tried to get Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to swear bayat, which is loyalty, in which every member of Al Qaeda has to do. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to this point still hasn't done it. But because bin Laden respected Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, because that he was a very active organizational leader, he made him chief of terrorist operations. And Al Thani gives Baer other details about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, including how some Qatari royals helped Khalid Sheikh Mohammed escape Qatar the year before when the CIA and the FBI had him surrounded. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed fled to Israel. And that's reported by the New York Times. Bin Laden in early 1998 allowed John Miller, a ABC News reporter, to interview him. Bin Laden, who spoke in Arabic to John Miller's questions, Bin Laden doesn't know how to speak English, would answer in Arabic. However, in the interview, John Miller doesn't know what Bin Laden is saying because one of the prerequisites of interviewing him was that you would not have a translator, so you couldn't know what Bin Laden was saying. There's a reason for this. According to John Miller, he says that the reason for this was because Osama bin Laden, in the interview, uh, stated he was going to war with the United States. Sitting behind, when bin Laden was sitting, there was a map behind bin Laden. And bin Laden did this so that he could show John Miller where he's going to attack. And behind him was a map of the world, but right behind bin Laden's head is the continent of Africa. 8 months later, 2 U.S. embassies are bombed in Kenya and Tanzania. Also, earlier that year, need I forget to mention, bin Laden gave his second fatwa. This time, it was the declaration of war against the United States as a whole. This war would be against civilians. And one of the declarations in the fatwa, which was promoted by the Shura Committee of Al Qaeda and accepted by its emir Osama bin Laden, in which it said that you must kill Americans and Jews wherever you find them. The war against the Crusaders and the Jews. And so this was the declaration of war. With this, the CIA conducts their own operation and a plan. And later in 1999, George Tenet would declare war on Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. It was the first time in history where an intelligence service would declare war on a single individual and against an organization. Usually it's against a country. At this point, Al Qaeda approximately had 2,000 to 2,500 individuals within the organization. It wasn't very big at all. After the successful attacks on the U.S. embassies, Bill Clinton would give a directive to the CIA's counterintelligence team to finally assassinate Osama bin Laden. This doesn't come to fruition because the CIA is worried about the wording of the document and said they would delay the process. The CIA wasn't still in this rebuilding mode. And in July of 1999, with the chances of a pipeline deal with the Taliban through Enron now becoming increasingly unlikely because the deal with the Taliban was not financially feasible for them, they started bombing. They said they would threaten to bomb the pipelines if they were built. Enron was a connection to the Texas company Arbusto and the Bush family, who was friends with Ken Lay, the owner of Enron. And it just so happened that the United States would later engage in a military war against the Taliban 2 years later. But they needed a reason to do so. And they would get that reason. At the same time, you had the Balkans, Chechen, Yugoslav wars against the Muslims. There were mass atrocities in the Chechen war. Number of groups that were linked to Al Qaeda, led by one of the military commanders called Ibn al-Khattab, who had recruited Al Qaeda fighters into his ranks to fight against the communists in the Balkans. Bin Laden would send emissaries as well as a number of his Al Qaeda fighters to help Ibn Khattab, and they would forge a friendship. This would be seen as also as financing terrorism. The State Department considered the Chechen Muslims as an adversary to the West, which led to the mass atrocities by Srbidan Milosevic, which slaughtered wholesale Muslims in the Balkans. Some of the worst atrocities I ever read were happening at this time in 1997, 98. And if you haven't read anything about the Chechen Yugoslav wars, I suggest you read some of those terrible atrocities against the Muslims. Tens of thousands killed, and it just assassinated, slaughtered men, women, and children. The United States, through the United Nations, didn't help the Muslims. And there was this one slaughter. I spoke about this. I forgot the name of the town where there was 5,000 men, women, and children in a schoolyard, I think, or a warehouse. And Radko Mladic, a general, persuaded NATO to leave, and they did, and they slaughtered everybody in the courtyard. The tortures that went on there, just brutal. It was terrible. And the Muslims saw this. And it gave rise to a lot of hatred by these Islamic organizations like Abu Sayyaf and Al Qaeda. And it would give rise to later militant organizations. So they saw this as the United States are not going to help us in Chechnya. They're not going to help us in Afghanistan. They left us behind. They're not going to help us anywhere. And yet, they're conducting a war against Muslims, which are just basically Wahhabis, in Afghanistan and in Africa. And this demonization of the Muslim world was now beginning. And I blame the intelligence apparatuses like the CIA and the foreign intelligence rings like British MI6 or the Israeli Mossad, and also the politics involved regarding the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. They did not help. And what we saw was a neoconservative backlash against Muslims as well, because they saw that bin Laden was a threat, and he was a threat that they can advantage. So a lot of these foreign policy outlines, like, for example, Oded Yanan or the Paul Wolfowitz Doctrine or the Bush Doctrine, and later the Project for New American Century, which saw or that they could use these groups like Al Qaeda to pressure them to do terrorist operations in which they'll expand on that and say they're going to fight a war on terrorism. You understand where I'm trying to go with it? Was bin Laden really a terrorist? Not initially. He later became that way through very nefarious individuals. And the intelligence apparatuses knew this. I'm convinced they knew this. And I can make a really good argument they did. And because all information, which is the most powerful commodity in the world, that information is relayed to the power structures of the world, which is the federal government, as well as governments all around the world. And that they can create foreign policy this way, policies of the future, how to expand its military empire and its corporate empires affiliated with it. Because with information about preconceived plots, you could allow those plots to happen and then take benefit in the reaction, which is usually excessive. And that's exactly what's happening in Israel. They antagonize the Palestinians, in which they defend themselves. And when they do, the response is usually extravagant. And Israel could basically say, well, we're defending ourselves. That's what the U.S. military is. And that's behind them is the neoconservative Zionist faction, as well as a Wahhabi faction of Saudi Arabia, the Gulf. At the same time, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is still afraid of Al Qaeda. They were going to attack them because the United States is still in Mecca and Medina. And so what they were doing throughout the late 80s and early 90s was they were sending tens of millions of dollars to notable Al Qaeda affiliates like Abu Sayyaf, Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia, Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, Al Qaeda in Afghanistan and the Sudan, and Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and later Boko Haram in North Africa. And these groups got bigger and bigger and bigger. However, in 1996, I forget to mention this, I don't want to forget. 1996, bin Laden's family had disassociated from Osama bin Laden as being an heir to the Saudi bin Laden group. So he wasn't getting money from there. But he was getting money from legitimate businesses in the Philippines through his brother-in-law, Mohammed Jamal Khalifa, and through many sympathetic Wahhabi Saudi princes in Saudi Arabia. The United States prepared a report for the intelligence apparatus called Sociology and Psychology of Terrorism: Who Becomes a Terrorist and Why, in which it states, and I'm going to read it from a direct quote, hold on, let me, quote, Al-Qaeda's expected retaliation for the U.S. cruise missile attack after the U.S. embassy bombings could take several forms of terrorist attack in the nation's capital. Al-Qaeda could detonate a Chechen-type building buster bomb at a federal building. Suicide bombers belonging to Al-Qaeda's Martyrdom Battalion could crash land an aircraft packed with high explosives into the Pentagon, the headquarters at the CIA, or the White House. Whatever form an attack may take, bin Laden will most likely retaliate in a spectacular way, end quote. And the CIA knew this. Now, I'm not going to repeat myself because the planning to hijack airliners came initially from the Bajinka plot transcripts and files from the Philippines police, in which I mentioned this many times before, that was shared with the federal government and the FBI, and they did nothing with it. They didn't secure the FAA or nothing like that. This wasn't even known to the Clinton or Bush presidency until much later. And so in the year 2000, bin Laden starts to ratchet up attacks on U.S. military installations. If the embassy bombing was to try and get Bill Clinton to invade Afghanistan, to overextend, to repeat the mistakes of the Soviets, in which that's what he wanted to do, was to goad the Clinton administration after the embassy bombings to come into Afghanistan, to basically not engage them in a military war. This wasn't about a military war. Al-Qaeda does not have a military. What they wanted was to use the Taliban, and the Taliban were unaware of this, as the military to fight against the U.S. military. And because the Soviets, who lost in Afghanistan, they would hope that the U.S. makes that mistake. They did. And it was worse. However, Bill Clinton was level-headed, and he didn't engage in the military. What he did was he sent cruise missiles into a training camp in Afghanistan and to a pharmaceutical installation in the Sudan. Nothing to do with Al-Qaeda whatsoever. And so in the year 2000, bin Laden creates a plot called the Millennium Plot, which was to have somebody from Europe travel into Canada and into the United States to bomb LAX airport. And his name was Ahmed Wassam, but that plan failed because he was arrested in British Columbia. In his car was a pack full of explosives. They were going to bomb Israeli, a graveyard, Israel, a Yemen hotel, the Radisson Hotel. It was a big plot that was going to happen, but it basically was a failure. But the intelligence reports were coming in that Osama bin Laden is trying to attack the United States abroad. And so the influence of the Egyptians had now taken hold. The far enemy approach is now here at the turn of the millennium. Al Qaeda was now seen as a terrorist organization starting from 1996 to the present moment. But beforehand, that wasn't the case. Bin Laden, at this point, was under house arrest by the Taliban because the Taliban saw where this was going. He no longer could he talk to the media, no longer could he create a fatwa. But they had no idea about what he was going to do when he created the planes operation. And so, because of this, the Taliban was caught completely unaware. The United States were attacked again. This time, the U.S. was coal bombing off the port of Aden, Yemen. Al Qaeda affiliates in Yemen, which is the second largest stronghold for Al Qaeda, have bombed using two martyrdom agents to bomb the south port of the USS Cole. I think it killed 19 people, or like 16. I don't know the number offhand. But this was the first time a U.S. military installation was attacked directly from Al Qaeda. Bin Laden releases transcripts about why he approved for this, and he was caught on the phone. Ayman al-Zawahiri actually was caught on the phone congratulating somebody in Yemen about the attacks. And that's why it was linked to Al Qaeda. At this point, there was a plan in operation, and this is called the Plains Operation, because still the U.S. military would not engage in a war in Afghanistan. Bin Laden, along with the help of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, allegedly, created the plans and operations to hijack the airplanes inside the United States and attack the United States in the United States. It was a covert plan, allegedly. However, I would submit to you that I think the CIA and the NSA knew. They knew what was going to happen. You don't need to hear me repeat this today because I've said it in numerous videos. So September 11th happens, and all of a sudden, this Saudi individual who was just beginning to make the rounds is now the most popular man in the entire world. Everybody knows who Osama bin Laden is. Everybody wants to kill Osama bin Laden, the enemy of the world, the free world, the enemy of freedom, the most wanted terrorist in the world. Was a 6'6" guy with a limp, hiding in a cave, who devised an operation so simple. But it seemed there was a lot of coincidences in allowing these attacks to take place. Bin Laden then knew what was going to happen, and so he leaves Afghanistan, along with Ayman al-Zawahiri, Suleiman Abu Ghaith. Mohammed Atef, Abu Hafs al-Masri is killed by a drone strike in Afghanistan. Bin Laden releases a number of interviews within 2001, 2002, one to Taisi Alawani from Al Jazeera, and using the media arm, the media committee of Al Qaeda, which is called As-Sahab Media, in which he videotapes his declarations as to the U.S. military invasion of Afghanistan, which was in response to the September 11th attacks, in which he predicted what would happen. And so, the U.S. military invasion of Afghanistan left bin Laden to flee into the borders of Pakistan and Afghanistan, in which the CIA conducted an operation called Operation Jawbreaker. I did a video about this. You can watch it in full to know about Operation Jawbreaker. The CIA, along with special forces, had bin Laden surrounded. And most of the Taliban and Al Qaeda were decimated, but not totally. U.S. Special Forces called in to try and surround bin Laden to try and block off his escape route to Pakistan. They refused. Bin Laden escapes. He goes to Waristan. There, he divides the family and Al Qaeda into groups. One group goes to in Iran, where they're under house arrest immediately. His oldest son, Saad bin Laden, is there, along with his wife. He stays in Waziristan, but then he relocates to Pakistan, where he stays in Jalalabad for the next 10 years. It's asserted that the ISI knew about this all along and didn't tell the CIA. The CIA and the ISI basically will agree with one another sometimes, but will disagree on others. But there were notable individuals that were caught in Pakistan with the ISI's help using the U.S. diplomatic services and the CIA, and they arrested Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi bin al-Shibh. And years prior, they captured Ramzi Youssef in Pakistan. But bin Laden is in a safe house in Jalalabad for years. It's asserted that he's in Afghanistan, he's in Iran, he's in Iraq, he's somewhere. Nobody knows. 10 years, he disappears off the face of the earth. But he's actually in Jalalabad. And it wasn't a secret. And that's because the ISI knew. Also living near a U.S. military installation for years in a safe house was the leader of the Taliban, Mullah Muhammad Omar. Nobody knew. Two of the most wanted men in the world were living next door to the biggest intelligence services and U.S. military installations at the time. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 happens, and it's an added gift for bin Laden. Now the United States was spending billions of dollars, billions, into two wars that would basically hurt the economy in the United States for years, in which bin Laden predicted what would happen in the mid-1990s when he was interviewed, in which he hoped for. And on May 1st, 2011, bin Laden is assassinated through the help of an informant as well as the CIA, Pakistan ISI, and listening to phone calls that were made near the safe house in Jalalabad. Now, I ask you, people in the room, they captured Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. They captured Ramzi bin al-Shibh. They captured Abu Zubaydah. They captured Mustafa al-Hasnawi, Amr al-Baluchi, who is the cousin of, the nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, all al-Qaeda figures. However, the one man who George Bush said that he would capture him and bring him to justice, instead, they assassinate him. Why? Why would they assassinate the man who is allegedly responsible for the events of September 11, 2001, the 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings, the USS Cole bombing, to an extent, the Khobar Towers in 1996? It would be easy to capture him. He's, at this point, I think he was 63 years old. He was in relatively decent health. And he basically wasn't going to be a physical threat. I mean, they sent in the U.S. military, special forces. Instead, they kill him and dump his body in the Indian Ocean so that his grave couldn't be a shrine for militants in the future. They could have easily captured him, brought him here in the United States, and brought him to Guantanamo, or probably Guantanamo. Were they afraid of what they were going to get out of him? Were they afraid of what he was going to reveal to them about his years in Afghanistan? That maybe that the intelligence apparatuses like the CIA or the ISI were covertly assisting him without his knowledge, or maybe with his knowledge? We don't know. The victims' families at the World Trade Center brought up the argument to the 9/11 Commission that they wanted bin Laden to be captured in the same way that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was captured. No, instead, he's killed. And that leads to the conspiracy theories to question whether bin Laden was even killed at all, because there's little to no evidence that he was. But I think they killed him. And the reason why I think they killed him was so that he couldn't basically tell in the future about his profile in his early years, or that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the organizer of 9/11, in which I don't think he was either. I think he had a minimal part to play. Al Qaeda would survive for a number of years, but they are still in existence. The most prominent part of Al Qaeda is in the Arabian Peninsula, although they are trying to regroup in Syria. All these groups like Dar al Sham, Jabhat al Nusra, um, these are all like Al Qaeda affiliates. They're Al Qaeda. They just have now these um, very differing ideologies within them, and they have to change their names every once in a while so that they're not being tracked by the intelligence services or the military. But the ideologies of the Egyptians that influenced bin Laden, the ideology that came from Abdullah Azzam, still lives in the terrorist organizations today, like the Islamic State and Boko Haram and Abu Sayyaf. They're still around. And any number of the organizations like Egyptian Islamic Jihad, they're still around. All these groups and organizations are, they were once shaped by the people who helped shape bin Laden's mind, the Wahhabi fundamentalists, like Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, Abdullah Azzam, and to an extent, even a former political and author, apolitical author, Sayyid Qutb. That's a whole nother conversation. But the bin Laden family is still around. Um, in 2003, Time magazine would publish a report that the Iranians had met with U.S. officials in Switzerland and said that they would hand over Saad bin Laden and other members of Al Qaeda that were under house arrest to the U.S. authorities. And what did the U.S. authorities say? No. Why not? Well, maybe it's because they could use that later to say that Iran is harboring terrorists. Oh, guess what? In 2019, that's exactly what they did, including a false report in 2020 that one of Al Qaeda's top lieutenants, Mohammed al-Masri, was assassinated by Israel and the United States. Iran would later say that that report was untrue, that he wasn't assassinated in Iran. Um, and so ends the story of Osama bin Laden. The bin Laden family, who at one point was close associates with the bin Laden, with the Bush family, that uh, association existed all the way throughout the 90s. But after 9/11, the Bush family basically had to disassociate themselves from the bin Laden family. But what they did was, in the hours leading after September 11th attacks and in the days prior, they allowed the bin Ladens to leave the country on private chartered jets, even while the country was still at a suspension of airlines. But because the Bush White House said that the bin Laden family could leave, they could leave. The FBI disagreed with this and said that they had more questions to ask them. But the bin Laden family, they still have family members here in Massachusetts. Um, Prominent people too. I think one of bin Laden's older sons, is in the United States. And they gave an interview to the media not too long ago, actually. So they're still family members of the bin Ladens here in the United States. Um, but not everybody in the bin Laden family, and it's a big family, are terrorists and, went about this. Osama bin Laden was always a black sheep of the family. Um, Quiet, reserved man. But there's still a lot of questions about him. And there's a lot of questions about the people who helped influence him, including Ayman al-Zawahiri, who actually was an informant for the Egyptian security services while they tortured him in prison. And he gave up a prominent member of his group, and his name was Isam al-Kamari, in which he never forgave himself. And Ayman al-Zawahiri was tortured mercilessly, terribly tortured, but that ideology shaped bin Laden's life. And the intelligence apparatus knew this, and they cultivated this. They didn't help themselves when the CIA and the Pakistan ISI knew what they were doing by giving millions of dollars and weapons to these terrorists. That's what the Mujahideen were. They were terrorists. But the old adage called "the enemy of my enemy is my friend." That's what they saw the Mujahideen. Or were they thinking long term? This is what foreign policy planners do at the White House, including one group, which is the Office of Special Plans, a neoconservative think tank. Is that these guys don't think about a year or 2 years down the road. They think 10 to 20 years down the road. Did they think that by helping the Mujahideen that they would create an enemy that would replace communism in the Cold War because the Cold War was ending? And that's the reason why they got involved? Well, that could be one of the reasons. They certainly didn't want to see Soviet Union expanded to Afghanistan. Why? Because they would become a superpower in which Zygmunt Brzezinski in the Grand Chessboard wrote about. And of course, after that came the rise of the neoconservatives, the Zionists in Israel, and their power structure inside the United States, which were growing at that point, to now shaping foreign policy surrounding and using the terrorists like Al Qaeda in the hopes of them conducting terrorist attacks in which they could take advantage of. And how could they take advantage of this? Well, by allowing these groups to attack certain institutions in which foreign policy could be shaped. By using terrorism to achieve a greater geopolitical means. You understand where I'm getting at? In essence, who are the real terrorists? Because after 9/11, it's approximately, whatever report you listen to, we could all agree over 1 million Iraqis were killed, over 150,000 Afghanis were killed. God knows how many Syrians are killed. I mean, that war is still going on. How many Libyans are killed? How many people are slaughtered in Yemen while the United States funds military aid to the Saudis. I mean, the war on the Arabs is noticeable. It's happening. And it comes from a disastrous foreign policy, which was shaped in part by Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and the ideology that he adopted that initially wasn't instituted into Al Qaeda in the beginning. They weren't originally a terrorist organization. They later were shaped into one by U.S. foreign policy. I'll take questions if you want. Is Mujahideen the same as Taliban? Same teaching in Pakistan? Chip Walker, how you doing? I spoke about this before. Now, the Mujahideen, the Arab Mujahideen, are led by the Wahhabi school of thought, which is a puritanical form of Islam. It's really not. The majority of the Sunni world uh, think Wahhabi Islam is basically a heretical a sect. They don't consider them Muslims. They consider them Takfiris. Takfiris, which are basically Muslims who basically call other Muslims who don't adhere to the principles that they believe in fake Muslims. Munafiq. Munafiq means fake Muslim. Takfiri is apostatizing, the act of apostatizing. This would help shape all the terrorist organizations you see: Al Qaeda, Abu Sayyaf, Boko Haram, Islamic State, Jabhat al Nusra, and others. And they're not considered Islamic, these groups. The Taliban are led by the Hanafi school of thought, which is basically a very the Hanafi recognizes the Quran and Hadith as a legal analogy or a juristic preference in regards to the religious law, Sharia. They're not wanting to expand upon that. They don't want to. They don't apostatize. They're not takfiri. They're basically an insular group, whereas the Wahhabis are extroverted. And there's other smaller differences as well. I hope that answered your question. Read mine. El Pero Reggae, you have a question? Was the question, do you think OBL was motivated by mean intended ideas or a twisted concept of good intentions? Is that the question you wanted me to ask? Was that it? If so, that's a damn good question. Boy, when he created Al Qaeda, it was basically through good intentions because Al Qaeda was used as a group that was training Afghans to fight against the Soviets or the communists through the arts of guerrilla warfare. So basically, when he created Al Qaeda, it wasn't to create them with a terrorist organization in mind. They didn't have an enemy, in other words. They didn't have like a geopolitical agenda in the late 80s, early 90s. It wasn't until he traveled back to Afghanistan in 96 where the ideologies of the Egyptians, the Takfiris, helped shape his mind and his ideology and use Al Qaeda as a military guerrilla staging point to conduct terrorist operations to antagonize the United States. And all did. Oh, all right. Yeah, I think initially he had good intentions, but I think through the manipulation of the Egyptian Islamists, uh, it became mean intentioned. Basically, look, through his actions, he antagonized the U.S. military to attack a Muslim country. And yeah, it was twofold. He wanted to drag the U.S. military in a long-standing war, and it worked. 20 years in Afghanistan and $2.3 trillion in debt. That's how much they spent in Afghanistan. Was it a success? I ask you, was the Afghan war a success? I would submit not. The Taliban now run the country. What the hell were we doing for 20 years in the country? Besides making the lobbyists of the military industrial complex and the foreign lobbyists rich. Because that's who got rich. As well as corrupted Afghan officials. But yeah, I hope that answered your question. And do we have any more? No, I guess not. But we have 11 people here. All right. We probably could end it there. But I hope that was a fruitful discussion for you about Bin Laden and his early years and up until his death. And I hope this was a beneficial and educational for you. And I'll end the stream there. And guys, thank you for coming. And have a good night. Thank you.